Introduction to learning disabilities. So first we'll start with the learning disabilities definition. So learning disabilities is conditions causing difficulty acquiring knowledge and skills that are at the same level or as their peers that are the same age as them. Some of the leaders were Samuel Orton, Anna Gillingham, Bessie Stillman, Romalda Spalding, and Grace Fernald, developing alternative methods to teach students who couldn't learn to read by memorizing sight words. So the PL 94-142 is the first federal law requiring schools to educate students with disabilities. So this is the Education of All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. The 504 is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, requiring employers to make reasonable accommodations for the people with disabilities. And here's the timeline. So first, in 1940, there's medical research limited to studying the functioning of brain-injured persons. Terms use minimal brain damage or minimal brain dysfunction. If served at all, LD students were put in classes for the educably retarded. Around 1955, there was medical research. Lane's terms use dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. LD students served in resource rooms. So, 1963, the formation of associations for children with learning disabilities. 1975, Congress passes the PL 94-142 of Education of All Handicapped Children's Act. 1990, the Congress passed Individuals with Disabilities Education, which extends refined services to disabilities. And in 1997, IDEA was reauthorized. So, learning disabilities continued. Causal factors are what causes the learning difficulty. Incidence factors are how often the disability is seen. Primary characteristics are the perceptual deficits, is the lack of understanding in students with disabilities. Co-occurring conditions would be ADHD and conduct disorder, and then Tourette syndrome. Programs of the least restrictive environment would be like counseling, locating needs services, and parenting advice, which are all pretty much done within the school. They point you in the direction of these kinds of services needed. So here's like the brain and the anatomy. So really the function of the brain is the nerves along the body pick up sensory stimuli and send messages via the spinal cord to the brain. The brain interprets what has been seen, heard, felt, smelled, or tasted, and it integrates new sensory knowledge which previously stored information and decides what to do with it. So for the learning, each part of the brain has something to do with the learning. So I guess some of the anatomy of that would be like the frontal lobe is for like your problem solving. Your temporal lobe is for your hearing and language. The cerebellum is balance and coordination. And then your occipital lobe is your visual information. Your parietal lobe is your sensory, so your taste, touch, pressure, and pain. The brain and learning disabilities. So start with like autism. So autism is a neurological disorder that affects a child's social development. Research showed that there are structural differences in the brains of children with autism. Now, the studies have showed also that the brains of autistic children oftentimes are increased in volume in some parts while reduced in others, this making for the social deficits. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, making it hard for children to focus. So the brain has trouble organizing and focusing on a task. The function of the brain is difficult of those without ADHD. So some of the research, the biochemical influences, pharmaceuticals, substances we eat, and things that we drink. These help the neurons connect to tell the brain what to do, because when you have situations like ADHD or autism, if you can medicate them enough to where the neurons and the stimuli are connecting and they can get to the brain, that will help with like your focus issues. In the memory, making a memory is not a conscious act. Memories are controlled by chemical signals in the brain that are triggered by learning. So some type of things would be like having quiet classrooms that help with memory and visual supports. So like concept maps and things like that to help the student be able to look at it and kind of picture that in their mind. But other things are like chewing gum helps you kind of remember. You remember the taste. You can kind of remember what you learned. So the metacognition, the knowledge and control individuals have over their own thinking and learning, like your think alouds, note taking, verbal self mediation, which would be talking it out by yourself, mnemonics, which would be like associating like a phrase with like letters, and then your mapping and graphic organizers type things. Phonological processing is like typically with like delayed speech. The best way to correct this problem is with explicit and repeated discussion. So if you continually repeat the discussion, repeat what you're saying, it will help that student eventually have more of a fluent speech. So kind of like your timeline for your like laws over here would be the Education for All Handicapped Children, 1975, entitled All Children to a Free and Appropriate Education in the Least Restrictive Environment, including those with disabilities. Protected Rights of Children with Disabilities and Their Parents, now revised and appropriate under IDEA. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, was 1990 to 2000, designed to provide government services for those with disabilities in the field of education. Criteria for receiving services instead of government level. Child must fit in criteria. Requires an IEP and parental consent. And then Section 504 of the Civil Rights Act to prevent discrimination against those with disabilities in programs that receive federal funding. Less specific criteria to receive services. So that could be anything from like just a general disability, like my sister had it because she had diabetes. So No Child Left Behind Act in 2000 was school and accountability to government titles regarding student progress. Schools must submit an yearly report for public viewing. Annual assessments for grades 3 to 8 mandated funding can be revoked based on school progress. So now with the law, you have like your parental rights and your student rights. As parents, you're required, some of your rights would be to require confidential treatment for your child's records. Only a limited group of people within the school should have access to them. Review and inspect records, have copies of all records and any documentation regarding their child on file with the school. Others would be like requesting assessments, requesting meetings with the teacher, anything like that. So as parents, you are advocates of your child. You do have the rights to make decisions for your child and their rights. So some of the students' rights would be like to receive due process, prompt hearings, be respected in the classroom by your teachers, by other people, to have a safe learning environment, and then FAPE, so and also having different accommodations for them in their learning environment. So law and schools. So teacher rights and obligations. Teachers have a right to work in a safe environment. They have a right to teach. They have a right to be respected in the classroom. Their obligations would be like notify parents before the IEP process even begins in those assessments. Follow the guidelines for the IEP, which is very necessary, and work with parents by law. So they have to provide that information, provide the copies of the documentations and everything like that. The behavior intervention plan to find out why the student is displaying certain behaviors and decide how to help the child. suspension and expulsion rights, so cannot be suspended or expelled if incident was due to the disability the child has. If not, if it had nothing to do with that, then the school can go ahead with their normal suspension and expulsion processes. So the difference is so the purpose of the idea, the PL 9414 issue, is the federal state to ensure appropriate services for disabled children. And then Section 504, civil rights law to protect the rights of individuals with handicaps in programs that receive federal financing. All school-age children qualified as handicapped can have or have had a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So the idea is more like your special education, your mental disabilities, learning disabilities. And 504 would be like your learning disabilities and your handicap. So some of your definitions would be for multidisciplinary evaluation team, a team of at least 2 people in charge of evaluating students suspected of having learning disability. Read would be a review of existing evaluation data in charge of reevaluating a suspected student of special needs, which can be requested by a parent or the schools. The ITP is your individualized transition plan, a plan required by IDEA to facilitate the transition of a student with a disability from school to adulthood, work, and independent living. So your initial IEP would be the first IEP that must be put in place within 30 days of the evaluation meeting, which again can be requested by the parent or the school. The transition IEP is the ongoing process of collecting data that reflects your child's needs and preferences and interests as they move towards adulthood. The annual review IEP is a yearly review that allows the IEP team to revisit the terms of the IEP to determine whether it is adequately meeting the individual needs of the student and to assess whether the student is making the adequate progress toward annual goals. The reevaluation IEP is a reevaluation of the IEP that may be requested by any part of the IEP team, so parents, teachers, administration. This is used to make sure that the IEP in place is working for that child. If not, the revisions will be made. The manifestation determination is a review of the relationship between a student's misconduct and a disability. Due process hearing. These can be requested when there is a disagreement with the eligibility of a child for special education. At these hearings, the judge will decide the eligibility. An addendum to the IEP is to make a minor change to an IEP without having to rewrite a new IEP for that student. Progress reporting is to regularly report progress to parents, all parts of the IEP team, to note the progress being made by the